Good evening to everybody. This is Stefano, Master in Geopolitics from Italy. This evening we have Sean Bell, that is a former military of RAF, UK, and he will try to explain to us the actual military situation in the war in Ukraine. Tonight we will try to make the format a little bit different and shorter to try to catch your attention as much as possible. I will give directly the stand to Sean, and we will show you some slides and some updates. And if you have any type of question, just put it in the comments and I will collect it for you. So Sean, I will give you immediately the stand. Thank you.
Perfectly. Thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me all right. Thank you for the introduction. It's worth reminding the viewers, I was a military officer, flew jets in the military, in the Air Force, but I spent a lot of time on the ground in operations, both in Iraq, in Bosnia, and 3 tours in Afghanistan. So I've spent a lot of time on live operations. What I would say is that I also, as I'm a talking head for the Ministry of Defence. What does that mean? It means although I left 10 years ago, I still have a security clearance and I still get briefed regularly by the Ministry of Defence and others to try to provide the media with some help and guidance when it comes to what's going on in the war, because the serving military are not allowed to talk about the war, and therefore the media is clamoring, because the media generally looks at what is happening rather than the why it's happening. So and I currently do 3 to 4 days a week with Sky News and a number of other media outlets. What I'm not, though, I am not a mind reader. I can't work out what Putin is actually doing, and I don't like too much conjecture. As a former military man, I tend to look at things objectively rather than subjectively. And as many of you will know, in the information space, there are a lot of people making comments about this war. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but many of these opinions are very subjective and not based on any form of fact. So what I aim to do today is to give you a quick resume, I think, of where, from my perspective, we are with this war, and then pose a couple of questions to you, and then open it up to your questions, because I think we'll get more out of this with your questions. So if I was to look at phase 1 of the war, and this is really my words of phase 1, it was the invasion by Russia, 3 different efforts to take Ukraine. First one, just sort of walking in and expecting just to take Ukraine, and that didn't work. A second one to sort of with a 40-mile convoy to try and take Kyiv, and that didn't work. And then a sort of more sustained effort to throw forces at the Donbass and a more focused military campaign. That gave Russia some more success. And ended up with quite a lot of ground being taken. But it was also characterized by the West wanting to help Ukraine in some way, but really not knowing how best to do that, and providing a lot of defensive weapons like anti-tank weapons and the like. Phase 2 was that initial sort of invasion phase stalled somewhat. The West's weapons, which were much more focused on high-tech precision strike weapons, started to take effect. And I think we started to see the difference between Russia fighting a 20th century war, largely flying 20,000 rounds of artillery a day in a sort of blanket, leveling the countryside, leveling villages, leveling communities, killing a whole lot of people, innocent people along the way. Whereas the West has traditionally moved towards a 21st century form of warfare, which is much more based on precision weapons. The advantage of precision weapons is that you might not hit your target with a dumb weapon, but the precise weapon, if you know you can hit your target, you need a much smaller amount of explosive, and therefore you have to do less damage. A good example of that, I think, is in the Second World War. You know, we had 1,000 bomber raids with each of those bombers carrying 20 bombs, because the distance those bombs missed their target was about 4 miles. And therefore, even when you had 1,000 bombers with 20 bombs each, 20,000 bombs, you still couldn't guarantee to hit your target, but you'd level complete cities. These days, one military jet, the jets I used to fly, would carry 3 bombs. Each of those bombs would miss a target by 4 feet, not 4 miles. And therefore, each of those bombs would hit a target, much smaller charge, and much more devastating effect. And I think we're seeing that in Ukraine, where Ukraine is starting to use these Western weapons much more precisely, intelligence-led, combating in effect a sort of 20th century Russia. Now that second phase meant that Ukraine started to push Russia back. It pushed them back in the north around Kharkiv. It pushed them out of Kherson in the southwest, and it's also pushed a lot of pressure on the Russian efforts to take the Donbass, particularly around Bakhmut. And we can talk more about that if you like. But we've sort of ended up with the winter. I'm not saying the fighting has stopped, but the battle lines haven't moved a lot over the last few weeks. So that sort of lends us to, it feels like we're about to start phase 3 of this war. People call about the spring offensive that's much vaunted. The weather, I've known of several colleagues who are in Ukraine who are helping with the civilian effort, who say that a lot of the ground is very treacherous, very wet. If it freezes solid, then it allows maneuver warfare. But if it doesn't, you're confined to the roads, and that makes you very exposed. So at the moment, it looks unlikely anything significant is going to happen on that spring offensive. And the real question then is, what are the aims of the two parties as we go into this phase? And I think if we can pull up the slide if we can enlarge the slide and take it onto slide 2, if that's possible. And let's see if I can do that or whether you can do it.
Okay.
So just so we show, right. And can you, right. So go back a slide, please.
Okay.
Forward one slide.
This is the one.
Okay, one more.
Okay.
That's perfect. So, and this is, so what is this spring offensive going to look like? Well, President Putin has never changed his language. He's never called this a war, but he's talked about his special military operation. And that seems to be holding Crimea, the land bridge between Crimea and Russia, and the Donbass. And he took Luhansk to the north relatively quickly. And the efforts over the last few weeks seem to be to take Donetsk. And that's been largely focused around Bakhmut, particularly using the mercenary fighters of the Wagner group. Now, from a military perspective, they've lost a huge amount of lives over what is tactically something relatively insignificant. But what appears to be likely from the Russian perspective is if they can take the rest of Donetsk and they hold the Donbass, then it's quite possible that Putin, as an interim measure, might seek to get some form of ceasefire or declare some form of peace. Whether that would actually hold water or not is another matter. So the prevailing view seems to be that he will continue pushing into the Donbass and into the Donetsk. If we look at the next slide, though, the real challenge is what's going to happen with the Ukraine. And again, I re-emphasize that I have no inside track on this. And even if I did, I wouldn't be able to share that. But if you can just put one slide further on, please. The prevailing view is that if you could cut the land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea, that would make life quite difficult for Putin, it would also mean that the forces to the east of the Dnieper River would actually feel very vulnerable and almost certainly have to look at withdrawing. And it would allow potentially a move east as well, to potentially liberate Mariupol along the way. Now, again, this is conjecture, but it's a question of what this phase 3 might look like. And part of that depends on, I mean, this is Putin's war. It's up to what, Putin, where he wants to go next. The challenge for both sides is what resources they have. Now, Russia has lent quite heavily on the Wagner Group. It's running short of a lot of its machinery, but it has managed to mobilize a lot of people. The problem with people is they're not well trained, they're not well experienced, and they could end up being cannon fodder. But they have a lot of people to throw. From Ukraine's perspective, they need Western weapons. They are absolutely dependent on those weapons. And I think we're seeing some of the discussion most recently when President Zelensky asked for tanks. That definitely is a move from the defense to the offense, because tanks are an offensive capability. And we're seeing some of the rhetoric from Russia that recognizes that Western tanks could have a decisive impact on this war. And therefore, particularly with Germany struggling to work out whether it's comfortable at the front of that. And we can explore that if anybody wishes. The rhetorical questions I have as we get to this phase of the war, though, are I get asked regularly who's going to win. I think that's an impossible question to answer, because at one end of the spectrum, Russia takes the whole of Ukraine, subjugates the whole of Ukraine. That seems very, very unlikely to happen. Ukraine will hate Russia viscerally for most of the country, and Russia isn't big enough to subjugate the whole of the country. So that's really unlikely. The other end of the spectrum is that Ukraine kicks Russians out of every corner of Ukraine, including the Donbass and Crimea. And from a military perspective, again, that looks highly unlikely. Crimea has held out many times in history, and it will be very well defended, very difficult to get the Russians out of that, and also out of some sections of the Donbass. So the real question is, what is the compromise? Where does the line get drawn? At the moment, I think Ukraine would want to seize back more of its territory. I think at the moment, Russia might be happy if it takes the Donbass and Crimea, but how on earth any negotiated peace would happen is really difficult. But every war eventually ends up with some form of negotiation, however uncomfortable that will be. And again, I'm happy to explore that in questions. It's also, though, a matter of, because there's no winners in this war, there'll only be losers. And even if Putin takes some territory, he wanted to stop NATO expansion. He's failed in doing that. He wanted to make Russia great again. He's failed to do that. He wanted to enliven the Russian economy. The Russian economy is faltering now as a result of the sanctions and everything else that's going on. And he's having to increase the size of his military. So that's failed as well. And it's very difficult to see Russia recovering from this, even if it takes a bit of land. I think the other question that I would pose is that how long the West can continue to support Ukraine. The Ukraine is fighting a very brave and resilient battle, but it desperately needs Western weapons to maintain that. At the moment, the West has been providing weapons that are available rather than what Ukraine needs. And if you characterized it by the fact you can't go down to the supermarket and get these weapons, but if you go into the war chests of the Western nations that are helping, those war chests are gradually emptying, and they can't empty because that's risk for those nations. So at some stage, the West's appetite for this war will always start to waver. And unless we put our defense industry on a war footing the way that Russia is, there is a grave risk that actually Russia, despite being stalling at the moment, learns from those mistakes over the next 3 years, grows in strength, and its military capability. And if the West doesn't match that, then the outcome of this war could be very different. But anyway, at the risk, I think that's probably all I want to say as an introduction. There may be people on the call that want more. I'd much rather answer questions, though, on that rather than talk for the whole period of time. So if you're happy, I'm happy to call it a day there and take questions.
Okay, so first question from the public. How much do you think politically will dominate over strict military common sense in this conflict, causing perhaps unnecessary casualties on either sides?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what you mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that, for example, President Zelensky has said there's no negotiation until the Russians have left all of our soil. That is inevitably got to be his headline approach for Ukrainians. They paid a huge price for this invasion, and naturally they will want Russia out. Practically speaking, if you were, for example, to try to evict Russia from Crimea, that would be an immense military battle, which would cost Ukraine a huge number of lives, and from a military perspective, looks very unlikely it would prevail. And I think, at the risk of being too provocative, if you study your history, Crimea, probably history would judge Russia has, if not a limited call, a significant call that it's part of its territory. And again, risk of being provocative here, but in 1954, when Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine, Ukraine was a county, a region of the former Soviet Union, and it was handed to it more for administrative purposes than anything else. And when in the fall of the Soviet Union at the end, in the 90s, Russia and Ukraine almost went to war about Crimea, not about Crimea per se, but about Sevastopol and the port there. And given the history, Peter the Great, the hundreds of thousands of lives lost to secure a port for Russia, it seems unlikely that Russia would give that up lightly. So in answer to the question, I hope I've got the right, the tone of your question. I think at some stage compromise will be required. The real question is how on earth that happens. And I suspect, this is purely conjecture, that Western leaders will pull President Zelensky into a room, close the doors, and make clear that he's done an amazing job, but it's just not reasonable to spend another 100,000, 200,000 lives trying to get Russia out of Crimea. And actually, the West's appetite for continuing to pour weapons in to fund that is limited. And therefore, the nations and Zelensky will come to an agreement. When Zelensky leaves that room, it's quite possible he will blame the West for forcing his hand to compromise. But in a way, that's probably the way to avoid a massive hike in casualties for political ends. I hope I got the right tone of your question. So
yes, it's from the public, but I think yes. But this is what I'm trying to understand also from both parts, because I have friends both in Russia and Ukraine. The problem is that at the moment, from the public, I think that both sides propaganda is pushing for no compromise. But at the end, I think that it must need a compromise to end the war, because it's not. I think it's not possible to maintain the state forever. And I agree with you also that probably the solution will need a compromise about Crimea and maybe a special status on Donbass. I don't know. But the problem is that when I ask something like this to my Ukrainian friends. At the moment, they say no, and the opposite part for the Russian, it's the same about the change of the regime in Ukraine. So let's see what about the other questions. Military things that it's interesting for me. It's Italy is going to transfer the SAM T-missile system to Ukraine, but it's a French-Italian system, anti-aircraft, anti-missiles. Could be this type of weapon useful for the defense or no? Because I'm asking because it's very expensive. I think Italians are not super happy to understand that we will give one battery and it's about 800 million euro one battery. So it's.
I think there's a couple of questions here. I think one of them is air defense missiles are very expensive. Full stop. Whether it's a Patriot system, whether it's your system or whatever, they are expensive. The challenge is, what are you protecting, and is it worth that price? And that's an impossible question. But for example, at the moment, Russia is sending a lot of Shahed 136 drones, which cost $20,000 across to bomb Ukrainian targets. Now, the missiles, the air defense missiles sent up to shoot them down cost 10 times as much, 20 times as much as the thing they're shooting down. So in a conventional war, it would make no sense at all to use those systems. But the point is that if it provides a degree of protection for one civilian on the ground, it's worth it. So there are some interesting numbers around this at the moment, which means that air defense is actually not a military function now. It's actually a civilian function. Most of the air defense systems are trying to defend the civilian population, which shouldn't be targeted in a war. The air defense systems should be defending the military forces that are deployed in order to fight the battle. So in answer to the question, yes, of course, it'll be useful. The challenge, though, I think, where it's a bit more nuanced, is that at the moment, most nations recognize that Ukraine needs help and are looking in their cupboard and seeing what they've got in there that could help. And at the moment, let's take your air defense system. I understand there are at least 8 different air defense systems being offered to Ukraine. Every single one of those air defense systems has a different way of operating, has a different missile that needs to be fired at it. It has a different training regime associated with it. So you've got to learn how to operate it. It has a different spares support, logistics support in order to make it help. It has a different intelligence requirement to help inform where the missiles are coming from. Every different system that has a different logistics chain, a different ammunition system, vastly complicates the landscape. And what Ukraine actually needs is one system and lots of it. Now, I appreciate that's not always easy to do, but it plays to the point that in the first year of this conflict, Italy, the UK, in some respects America, but lots of other countries have wanted to feel good by helping Ukraine, and they have helped. But once we get into a serious war, and let's be brutal, Putin has put his country on a war footing now. Having lots of different forms of air defense, different forms of tanks, different forms of artillery
is not useful.
It is just not helpful.
Okay.
And that's where ultimately there needs to be some interesting conversations, whether in NATO or the allies that are helping Ukraine to work out. And we're seeing a bit of that in the tanks domain. My country has offered Challenger 2 tanks, but it's offered 14 of them. Zelensky needs at least 300, probably 500. The Challenger 2s make 5% of the number he needs. And the Challenger 2 has a bespoke round that goes in the gun. So it's helpful, yes, but as a military commander, I would not want to have that and loads of other forms of tanks. It's going to take a whole load of training. So that's why there's this focus on Leopard 2s, because the Leopard 2 is available in much bigger numbers.
This is the question, Sean. Connecting to you, it's the same. Poland is willing to send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. And this was a question, why Ukraine is asking so much for this type of tanks, and you are answering.
Yeah, no. So there's a couple of questions. That is a good question. First of all, why? I mean, President Zelensky famously said he's got lots of tanks because Russia keeps abandoning them, and he keeps jumping in and using them. The problem is that the T-64, the T-72, the majority of the tanks came into service in the 1960s. They are no match for a modern tank. And a tank is two capabilities, really. It's how thick is your armor? In other words, how survivable are you? And how powerful is your gun? Now, a modern battle tank has incredibly powerful armor and also has a gun that can be fired on the move, has laser target marking, and is incredibly accurate, and a set of rounds that can penetrate any Soviet tank. So those modern battle tanks, whether it's be an American Abrams tank or a Leopard 2 or a Challenger 2, are complete game changers. They will destroy any Russian tank on the battlefield, apart from the T-14 Armata tank, and there's very few of those about. So these tanks will be a game changer, and that's why Russia has been upping the ante and threatening the West. As regards Poland, I think there's been some interesting political dynamics here, because the press painted it that Germany was reluctant to send Leopard 2s. They needed to provide the export licenses for others to do it. Poland, as a close partner of Ukraine, said, well, if Germany's not going to do it, we will do it anyway. And of course, the danger of that, it puts a rift in the alliance, which is just what Putin is trying to do. So there was lots of papering over those cracks. And without wishing to bore the audience, there's a very good reason why Germany is got to be really careful here. The Allies at the end of the Second World War dismantled Germany's military capability. At the Cold War, they allowed it to build up some military capability, but only for defense. The population of Germany is scarred by its memory of World War II. It's very happy to support Ukraine with defensive weapons. Offensive weapons is a big, big step for the culture. And I think what we're seeing, I understand today that Germany has said we won't stand in the way of partners who operate Leopard 2 deploying them. And that's really diplomatic language, because it's not saying we are going to send Leopards 2, we're not going to stand in the way. And I think what that should do is open the door for Poland and maybe other nations to send more Leopard 2s. It may also allow Germany to finesse being able to provide spares. It also can provide training, and therefore Germany could provide some invaluable support for helping get these Leopard 2s into the war, which is what Zelensky needs.
So it finally, it was like to don't give directly the tanks, but indirectly.
I think,
kind of,
exactly. But politically, it's a really important point that the press had made Germany appear as if it was being difficult. And because of the German history written into its constitution, it was very difficult for Germany to be seen as the one nation that was sending offensive tanks to take on Russia. Whereas as long as it's a group of countries and Germany is not standing in their way, that is easier politically for the country to stomach than being at the front of it. So it's really good use of diplomatic pressure to get the right answer, which is that Zelensky gets his Leopard 2 tanks and Germany doesn't feel like it's to blame.
Okay, another question that is like about Bakhmut, but still holds. But what could be the next scenario after the loss of Soledar? And connected to this one from the public, that is Bakhmut is the part of the third main line of defense. It's breaking. The question is the fourth and the last defense line, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, are the weakest line in Donbass. So I don't know about it, but just for
Yeah,
opinion.
there's an interesting question here about tactics versus strategy. Tactically, I think Ukraine has done a very clever job here because they forced Russia to lose a lot of military capability, not just equipment, but tens of thousands of people, trying to take what is effectively a little bit of ground in the Donbass. And then walking away gradually, they walked out of Soledar. The Ukrainians walked out of Soledar when it was a lost cause. And they're forcing Russia to pay a very high price for every pace they walk forward. Now, okay, you could argue, but Ukraine is giving ground. Yes, they are. But if you look at this strategically, Russia is running out of military equipment. It had to mobilize 300,000 extra people, which was a real problem for President Putin, because that now brings the war back to the domestic audience. The domestic audience doesn't really know what's going on because they are in a controlled information environment. But if they're losing their sons, their fathers, their husbands in a war, that becomes a lot more personal. So by forcing Russia to pay a high price for every step, it is regrettable that Russia is taking ground. But if you look at how much ground it's taking, given that it's trying to take the whole of Ukraine, actually it's quite a clever tactic to force Russia to bleed itself to a standstill over a relatively immaterial bit of ground, because as soon as you now allow a spring offensive to take on and West's weapons, you're now taking on a Russian military that is a spent force, that is no longer capable of fighting. And I think what's most interesting about the Donbass is your audience will know that private military organizations are illegal in Russia, but Russia has been using the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin led, a convicted thief. But why has he been doing that? He's been doing that because Putin judges that tens of thousands of convicts lose their lives. Russia won't worry too much about that. If it saves the lives of their mobilized men and women, then they'll be very happy that Yevgeny's convicts die. But actually, now that the Wagner Group has largely not been wiped out, but it's lost a huge amount of its people, now it looks like Putin is reverting back to his more usual military model. So I think in answering the question, would I speculate about Bakhmut? I think Bakhmut is always going to be vulnerable if Russia does pour all of its resources at it. But it's paying such a high price for that small little bit of land that actually will not be well placed then when the main torrent of the Ukrainian spring offensive strikes.
Okay, another is about the mobilization. I have the last 2-3 questions. What could be the impact of the Russian mobilization of the current phase of conflict? And because one part of these mobilized troops probably is not still on the front. And from the public, does the Russian 300,000 mobilization of reserves have prior military experience or not?
Yeah, I'll take those two together. I mean, I think traditionally mobilization creates quantity, but it doesn't create quality. And so if you want to generate large numbers, mobilization does that for you. But the battlefield is no place for inexperienced soldiers. And but it depends how the officers and the leaders want to use them. there are lots of examples in history. For those who study their history, China would send hundreds of its soldiers to against an American machine gun nest, knowing full well that the machine gun would have to stop after 100 rounds of firing. So if they had 110 soldiers, 10 of them would get through. Well, that's not a way of fighting that the West can meet. But for Russia, quantity therefore does have a quality if they don't care how many die. Now, in the West, we would never be able to stomach those sorts of casualty rates. So in answer to the question, quantity does have a quality all of its own. Putin's mobilization of 300,000 will have an impact. But I think once this war is over, I think history will judge that there were a lot, Russia paid a massive price in injuries and in deaths unnecessarily by putting inexperienced soldiers on the battlefield. And also, they haven't got the right weapons. If reports are to be believed, they're putting a lot of very old weapons in the hands of these youngsters. And that, in a modern battlefield with precision weapons, there is no place for them there. So the prevailing view of military analysts is, yes, you can generate people quickly, but military capability is people, equipment, training, doctrine, experience. There's a lot of factors, and you don't create military capability just through generating numbers. So it might make them feel good, the Russians feel good, but I'd be very surprised if that translates to a significant advantage on the battlefield.
Just another connected question. What is the difference, in your opinion, between mobilized Russian troops and mobilized Ukrainian troops?
This is an excellent question, because at face value, nothing. On the real value, though, of the difference is that how many of those Russian mobilized troops know what they're going to do. They're being fed a diet that Russia is being attacked, and that they are simply trying to exterminate the Nazi threat in Ukraine. When they get to the battlefront, they're seeing fellow Slavs get slaughtered. They're watching women and children get slaughtered. They're watching communities get slaughtered. All the reports coming back from intelligence suggest that the morale of those mobilized soldiers is rock bottom, because what they're being told at home compared to what they see in the battlefield is completely different. Now, for the Ukrainians, their country has been invaded. Their communities have been destroyed. Their wives, their mothers, their children have been killed. Their futures have been destroyed, and they are fighting for their very freedom, their country. There is no better motivation for soldiers than protecting your families, protecting your communities, protecting your way of life. That means that the Ukrainian mobilized folks, I'm talking about the vast majority of them, will be passionately happy to give up their life if that extinguishes Russia from their terrain. That motivation is an extremely powerful on the battlefield when it comes to soldiers, and that is the key difference.
Last two questions and then we close. One that is about your field, because it's about Air Force. Why doesn't seem to have been a visible impact of the Air Forces on both sides in the conflict?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There are several factors, I think, here. One of which is the Ukrainian Air Force is tiny compared to the Russian Air Force. So if it was to take on the Russian Air Force in a straight fight, the Ukrainian Air Force would lose. I mean, let's face it, they've got older, former Soviet Union equipment. They would lose. So the part of what Ukraine will undoubtedly be doing is avoiding a straight fight. Other factors, though, that play into this are more about, again, the difference between equipment and capability. The Russian Air Force has some very capable equipment. But first of all, you need a lot of training to be able to use it. The most effective use of air power in this sort of conflict would be supporting your soldiers on the ground, what's called close air support. I used to fly close air support in Harriers, and it's festeringly difficult to do because you're operating in a high-speed jet, close. Your enemy and your friendlies are very close together. Really difficult to make a mistake, and therefore, really easy to make a mistake. Therefore, you're paranoid. You need loads of training, and even with loads of training, it's difficult. Now you factor on top of that the weather around the Donbass where the fighting is happening is dreadful. Lots of thick cloud. It's not easy to operate there. So the Russians haven't got the training. They haven't got the experience. They haven't got the weather. So I think that's one of the reasons why they're not getting involved there. And why the Russian Air Force is not getting involved further across the country. Well, the Russian bombers they are launching their long-range missiles, and they're definitely involved. But as soon as the Russian Air Force goes across the border towards Ukraine, Ukraine has some quite clever surface-to-air missile capability. And I don't know the numbers, and I'm not sure anybody does at the moment. I'm sure after the war they'll come out. But Russian aircraft feel very vulnerable as soon as they fly over Ukrainian territory. Ukraine is a big country. And as soon as they get 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 miles into Ukraine, they're incredibly vulnerable. And the third reason I think we've not seen the Russians involved is that in the West, certainly in my country and in America, the Air Force is an independent service. As a result of its, the Army used to operate the Air Force as well, but gradually it became evident you needed to have an independent service. Otherwise, it got dragged into only providing close air support rather than actually having a more strategic role. The Russian Air Force isn't an independent Air Force. It is an artillery arm of the Russian army, and therefore doesn't have an independent role, doesn't have an independent strategy. And when the weather's not very good, it can't really get involved with the army. It hasn't got much training. By all accounts, it's running low on its weapons. And therefore, we've not seen much of it. But again, I think this plays to the Russians playing a 20th century war, whereas the West fights a 21st century war. What we would be doing is the West here is we would mount an air campaign, take out the air defensive to make provide air dominance, and then we would use air power to support our soldiers on the ground. That is clearly not what the Russians are doing. It makes no sense at all unless you recognize the Russians are just not capable of doing it. And I think that's why the Russians haven't dominated the skies.
I have a last question just to close in 45 minutes, as we said. Still from is not 42. What will be the potential repercussion for NATO if hypothetically Ukraine were to decisively lost the war? And connected to this one, that it's about the phrase of U.S. General Mille expressed a strong doubt that Ukraine would success in driving Russian troops out of the territory or out of its territory this year. So these two questions are connected. That what we have to expect, it's for sure another, let's say, long war.
Yeah, I think I'd tackle the first question really. I think if Ukraine was to decisively lose the war, I think the message that sends to the world is that you can be a bully and you can get away with it. So whether you're North Korea, whether you're China, whether you're Iran, that would embolden countries around the world that thought that, right, we can now do what we like and nobody will be able to stop us. Also, if Russia's wanted to take Ukraine, if you look at Putin's speeches, you look at his history, he's not going to stop at Ukraine. You know, there are a lot of other countries that I think would be on his target list, and they would be vulnerable. It might not happen this year, might not happen next year, but why would it stop? Why would Putin would feel emboldened? He would learn the lessons of how he could do it more ruthlessly, more effectively, and in the future that would happen. Not sure it's a lesson for NATO. I think it's a lesson for the Western world. The danger is we NATO is a defensive alliance, and it's we could discuss that for ages, but in essence, it's a defensive alliance. But this is about the individual nations having the right of self-determination. And there are some small nations, there are some big nations. Most of the small nations, even some of the middle nations like ourselves, would struggle to defend against a full Russian onslaught. So in a way, the West cannot afford to let Ukraine lose decisively, because the impact on global security would be significant. We seem to be moving to a world where there is a liberal democracy and a autocratic capitalism. And we sort of, everybody's been doing business with each other, with the Russians, with the Chinese, but actually pretty quickly, I think we're going to start only doing business with people that we trust. We clearly thought we could trust Russia. Germany particularly, signed massive contracts for energy, made itself dependent on Russian energy, and then found ourselves, it's really painful when, Russia invades Ukraine and then tries to stop the West helping Ukraine by inflicting pain through using energy as a weapon, even food as a weapon. So I think there are lots of lessons that flow from this. The short answer is the West cannot afford to let Ukraine lose comprehensively. But I choose my language carefully. I don't think Ukraine can win. I don't think Russia can win. I think it is a matter of where the line gets drawn, and that will be incredibly emotive. I absolutely think that's an incredibly difficult job. It might involve the United Nations to create some buffer zone. It might include reparations. It might include promises from the West to help Ukraine rebuild. What I would note, though, is that in the Second World War, Germany lost and it was devastated. One of the most powerful countries in Europe now is Germany. And actually, some form of compromise might end up in the longer term creating a very powerful legacy for Ukraine as it forges itself as an independent country. But I think it's a really, really good question. But I think it's the question that Western politicians are asking, because bluntly, all our nations are suffering with high energy costs, high inflation. There are lots of domestic issues, and the war in Ukraine feels a long way away. But if we ignore it, if we let Putin win, the lesson, not just for Putin, but also other similar states around the world, I think we would live with that legacy for a long time. And I think most Western leaders recognize that. I think you're muted, sir.
You're right. So I wanted to thank you so much and thank for the public to be tonight, and we will try to make other streams in the next weeks, maybe concentrating more on a focus that is about energy. Just to give a data only to close in a happy way, not about the war, but about the energy price, only for the people that is thinking that Europe is frozen, and the gas prices in August was about 300 euro for cubic meter. Now it's about 55-60, so it's 1/5 of the price that was in the summer. So what does it mean in the top coldest season of the year? It's that the market is stabilizing. It was afraid about the, let's say, threat that without the Russian gas we cannot survive, but actually we are surviving. So I think that economically, as you said, the problem for Russia it will be to find other, let's say, buyers, because China and India are not growing up at the moment, so they cannot increase as much as possible the gas and energy from Russia. So probably we will have at that point for a compromise in both battlefields, economical and war fields. Hoping that a peace can come as soon as possible, because I have friends both parts, so we hope in a peace. And thank you for your time. Wait 1 second, just when I'm ending, and thank for the people who stayed here. If you have any type of comments or questions, just put in the comments. If you liked the video, just put the like and subscribe to the channel, and see you on the next streams. Thanks, Sean, and thank to everybody.
You're welcome. Ciao.